Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Long, and I'm the pastor of the Salt Lake City Community of Christ. And it is my extreme honor to have this wonderful guest on today. He is not only a dear and wonderful friend of mine, he is brilliant, just brilliant. And I'm going to let him introduce himself. And then we're going to talk about what we're going to be talking about today. So, hello, Richard.
Hello, Carla.
It seems like you're not thrilled with my introduction. I definitely think that you're brilliant, and I'm so excited.
I just thought it was funny.
So, Richard, before we jump into our show here, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm Richard Perry Howard, half Norwegian. I don't know what the other half is, but I became a church historian in 1966 and then served there till 1994 when I retired at the age of 65. And I've been retired ever since. It's been the longest vacation I've ever had.
Oh my gosh, I am already excited about that long vacation. And I actually think a lot of us will not be able to retire at 65 anymore. So you might be a very lucky person to get to do that. Hopefully I can too someday. So I've asked Richard to be on here with us because, as he mentioned, he was the historian for Community of Christ for many years. And what I was curious about was his opinions, his thoughts about the three most pivotal moments in Community of Christ / RLDS history. And actually, you out there who's watching this, you might have your own opinions about what are the three most pivotal moments in Community Christ / RLDS history. And I would love to hear those too. So feel free to write in the comments about your thoughts about the three most pivotal moments. But I'm going to go ahead and let Richard take it away with one of his pivotal moments, and let's see if you agree. So, Richard, what is your first most pivotal moment in Community Christ history?
Before I get into that, I want to say that these are not the three most pivotal moments. I had agony trying to focus down onto three that I could work with. There are a lot of others, so I'm glad you invited others to submit some written responses. Anyway, the first one, in my judgment, was the publication of Robert Flanders' PhD dissertation called Nauvoo, Kingdom on the Mississippi in 1965. Flanders is a fifth generation RLDS Community of Christ person, however, since 1980, Presbyterian. His ancestry dates to Alpheus Cutler's Minnesota group that followed after the diaspora from Nauvoo. And so he is a gifted, brilliant analytical mind. After his graduation from Graceland in 1949, he went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and there he won 3 straight degrees, bachelor's, master's, and his doctorate. His doctoral dissertation, written in 1964, were finished and accepted and defended, I guess that was the word, and accepted in 1964. Was published then the next year by the University of Illinois Press. He was all this time, most of this time, he was on the Graceland College faculty, where he served several more years after the publication of his dissertation. Then he moved on to Ohio and then eventually to Southwest Missouri, where he was on faculty at Southwest Missouri State University in, I think he retired there about the time I retired, because we're the same age. Early in 1964, one of the really big, prominent apostles in the RLDS church didn't even wait to knock. He plunged into the historian's office with a box in his hand and And he seemed very agitated and concerned, and he plopped the box down on the desk of Charles Davies, a church historian who was my boss at the time. I was a newly appointed assistant historian under general church appointment. And we'd been having a conversation when the apostle popped in. Well, he said this as the box hit the desk. He said, "This is going to split the church wide apart." Well, there were already tremors of an impending schism in the church over the Book of Mormon translation, evolution, ecumenism, the liberal leanings of Graceland College's leading lights in history and sociology and literature, and also some of the seminary training that was going on with church headquarters personnel in, well, that started back in the late 50s and went on through, clear on through the 60s and 70s. Well, anyway, the apostles fear that Flanders' book would be the capstone in the falling apart of the church. Well, Davies and I read Flanders' doctoral dissertation. It was a scholarly analysis of the community in Nauvoo, because Joseph Smith was the central person and force in community life at Nauvoo. He came in for some very detailed analysis by Flanders, and he didn't really emphasize his spiritual character so much. Well, let me give you a quote. He was a man of affairs, planner, promoter, architect, entrepreneur, executive, politician, filibusterer, matters of which he was sometimes less sure than he was those in the matters of the spirit. End of quote. Well, for decades, the church press had published missionary and educational materials celebrating Joseph Smith's spiritual genius as prophet, seer, revelator, translator. Well, Flanders' picture of Smith was infinitely more complicated. Smith was, in fact, a multi-dimensional character. So by the 1980s, the content and implications of Flanders' book had pretty well thoroughly become digested into the community of Christ and to our historical grounding. This much broader portrait of Joseph in his time and in his place changed radically how the church has evolved to understand its early development, its founding events, and so much about its character. Another index of the force of Flanders' study of Nauvoo occurred in June 1966. About 2 months after the conference appointed me a historian, the presidency appointed me to be the chair of a newly formed church history committee. Well, the committee included Alma Blair and Paul Edwards and Don Landon and Jeff Spencer, recently arrived from Australia. Robert Flanders acted as a consultant to us from time to time. By that time, he was living in Ohio at one of the universities there. I waited several months. Oh, I'm sorry. The committee met a half a dozen times during 1966 and 67. In May of 67, we presented our report to the first presidency, all three of them. So all five of us trooped in to sit across from the three members of the first presidency with W. Wallace, the president, sitting behind his desk The rest of us were grouped around in a kind of a semicircle. We read the report. We received comments on it from Presidents Draper and Cooey all throughout the morning, various paragraphs of it. But the thrust of the report was to project the next historiography of the church should be analytical, fundamentally analytical, not quote sacred or hagiography or some kind of flag waving exercise. Well, we left there. I waited several months for the first presidency's written directive on what would be the next step. Where should we go? I tried several more times over the next year or so to get their written directive. Well, by late 1968, I finally was told by Apostle Clifford Cole, who was my immediate supervisor, that the report lay on President Smith's desk and that neither of his counselors could take it off the desk for discussion or action. President Smith had remained silent throughout the 3-hour presentation and discussion of our report, and after the passage of a year, it had become clear President Smith simply was not interested in the more legitimate history that he had assigned us in his letter of June 1966. I've often wondered why that was so. And then I thought about, well, right after a conference of 1966, the presidency appointed F. Henry Edwards, recently retired from his 20 years in the first presidency. They appointed him to continue the 4-volume history of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, published, I think, in 1901 through 1906, written by Joseph III and Heman C. Smith. He was to follow that format and produce a more or less up-to-date history of the church up into the 1970s. And his 4 volumes did appear. And it could be that his work was one of the factors in President Smith's decision not to rush into something radically different. In late 1968, Paul Wellington, managing editor of the Herald, who had a very favorable view of Flanders' book, he invited me to begin a monthly column on church history. And so I began that in January of 1969, and the column ran clear up till the retirement of Paul Wellington at the end of 1984. The column was called Since Yesterday, and almost every month, members of the church had access to a sort of a different, more objective, more detached approach to the church's story. So I think, the church's considerable debt to Robert Flanders endures to this very present moment. That's why I've thought of it as such a pivotal moment in the life of the church, because of its continuing impact.
So let me make sure that I understand why it was such a pivotal moment, and please tell me if I don't understand. So up to the point of Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi, we viewed Joseph Smith Jr. as not simply, he was never simple, as a prophet, revelator, seer, etc. And Robert Flanders really looked at the whole person, Joseph Smith Jr. And for the first time, we were really forced to look at the whole person rather than just spiritual guy.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We got most of our impressions of Joseph Smith from the Doctrine and Covenants by reading his inspired statements and documents in the Doctrine and Covenants, those first 100 sections. And so we had always felt that this was the essential Joseph Smith Jr. It's kind of interesting that we did it that way. Let's see, it was Inez Smith Davis's book on called The Story of the Church. That was our only one-volume history. And we had it from 1934, and it may still be in print. I don't know. But in one of her observations about Joseph, she said this, I can quote it almost from memory. Joseph Smith, I'm sure, made some mistakes, but his motivations were always pure.
Wow.
Now, that's really quite a statement, and it stood out in my mind down through the years as she did him a terrible disservice by assuming that his motives at every point in his life were pure.
Yeah, because who actually has motives that are pure all the time? Who? I mean, really, who? I mean, besides you, of course, Richard. Besides you. Well, thank you. That's really interesting. So I remember reading Nauvoo Kingdom on the Mississippi for seminary, and I mean, it didn't strike me as like that outrageous, maybe because I grew up in the 80s and 90s when more of that stuff was becoming more digested by members of Community of Christ than RLDS. So maybe that's why it didn't blow my mind, but it was probably mind blowing way back when. So that's pretty awesome.
It was.
Okay, let's go on to number 2. What is the second most pivotal moment in Community Christ / RLDS history?
Well, I think it was the statement on objectives of 1966 given to the 1966 World Conference. The RLDS Church had long understood and pursued its mission under the guidance of a hierarchical structure inherited from Joseph Smith at Kirtland and Nauvoo. The church's first presidency and Council of 12 and the presiding bishop, they were, you might call, well, they were officially called the Joint Council. Now, these 18 officers directed the missionary work and apostolic field administration through a clearly designated priesthood structure, including councils and districts and stakes and regions, and eventually missions in other countries. Newly appointed missionaries and field officers were added so that by the early 1960s, more than 200 full-time ministerial appointees, as they were called, were working under the direction of the Joint Council. The field missionaries used the church's scriptures and other limited training resources to help guide them in their work of whatever they were doing out in the field, is winning converts and strengthening the church's presence in the world. The two widely understood and proclaimed aspects of the church's presence were these: evangelize the world, Zionize the church. This meant winning souls to Christ, and in the field jurisdictions, building up the kingdom of God in whatever ways that might be devised. Now, some of the more knowledgeable and educated field ministers and church appointees began to press the Council of 12 for more definitive and they wanted to know exactly what is the church's purpose and mission, besides these two very general ones. Well, are there specific goals and objectives that you can give to us? They would write to the members of the Council of 12 that will help to motivate us and instruct us in our work so we can be more effective. Some appointees even describe their feelings as spinning their wheels on the ice of hazy generalities. They voiced the need for a clearer set of definitions and parameters to sharpen their grasp of what they were supposed to be doing on a day-to-day basis. They felt they were treading water in a sea of confusion. They needed much help to work toward the achievement of identifiable, manageable goals. And Clifford Cole, who was president of the Council of 12, he listened to these questions and he read them and all these feelings from the missionary and administrative appointees. And he worked with his staff and his peers to produce and distribute to every church appointee a survey trying to elicit their most detailed understandings of where they were with regard to the church's purpose and mission. The Joint Council considered the tabulated findings gained from about an 85% return of that questionnaire. The Council of 12 members, Clifford Cole, Charles Neff, Dwayne Cooey, framed half a dozen specific objectives and then submitted those to the presidency, and they worked then with the presidency to refine them, and they finally ended up with 5 objectives given to the World Conference. But the church officers did not propose a motion for the World Church Conference to adopt them. They were just announced. Well, I was a delegate to that conference, and I felt encouraged by what I heard. The first reading of the prologue of it just had me on cloud 9, because I thought it was, clear up until last Tuesday, I have thought very often for that prologue to become part of the Doctrine and Covenants. For me, the 5 objectives gained much of their appeal to the church members from its prologue. Here are some salient excerpts from that statement. As a prophetic church, we are called to discern the signs of the times. Such a role is far more profound than merely predicting the course of events in the modern world. It means that we shall look at the world through the eyes of faith, and under the impress of the Spirit of God shall discern to some degree the issues which are being raised and the nature of the choices being put before us in a world in which God is at work. Discerning the signs of the times means striving to understand what the church is called to be and to do in this particular moment of time. As man is involved in conflict in all areas of life, particularly within himself as he struggles for an understanding of the purpose of life, we are aware that the church is called to make visible before the world the reconciling power of Christ. This can produce in each nation where the gospel is planted a community of such spiritual dimension that it must be called Zion. Well, by the fall of 1966, the general officers were moving throughout the domestic church, and I think even to several nations overseas, and held goals conferences based on that crucial statement of objectives. Excitement, perplexity, fear, confusion, and even anger among the saints resulted from those conferences. Particularly the first and the last objective elicited resistance, strong resistance from some of the more traditional members. For example, objective 1, this one called the church to clarify its theology and unite the members in their faith. Hundreds of local members saw no need to delve into theology. This term suggested formal seminary degrees, which many of our key leaders and personnel had attained or were pursuing. The traditionalists knew their faith in terms of its prized doctrinal propositions, many of which they understood to have been revealed through Joseph Smith, the founding prophet. Well, they therefore rejected the idea that theological exploration could ever unify the members in their faith. So the seeds of schism were thus planted in the soil of the traditional one true church congregations across the land. This in turn launched an enduring season of brooding concern in the hearts and the minds of the general officers of the church. You know, what are we going to do about the people that are feeling so badly? Many local church leaders also had strong issues with the objective number 5, which called the church to interpret Zion in worldwide terms. Traditionalists held a view that Zion was Jackson County, Missouri, period, end of statement. And so it was calling them to think about Zion being established in other nations of the world. That was so foreign to their understanding that they couldn't accommodate to that. Many of them were heartbroken that the church seemed to be de-emphasizing the center place and Zion is Jackson County, Missouri, and on and on. So those two objectives, just think of them together, and there were 3 others, but these brought about the most visceral kinds of responses, negative responses. And so these 2 objectives were calling the members and the church and church leaders alike to blow the lid off their previously held doctrinal positions, and then to enter the strange and ambiguous field of theology as a possible source of unity. Come on, they were thinking, those folks in the pews, many of them were thinking, well, not all of them, a lot of people embraced those and were excited about them. And so it wasn't the whole church. Okay. They were being called to move from geography to theology. Resistance to those objectives, plus the mixed results from the goals conferences, stimulated the first presidency to organize a disciplined series of joint council seminars on theology, history, scripture, education, and mission. The purpose was to get all the joint council members onto the same page, so as eventually to unify the whole church in the field around basic understandings and common purpose. This program continued on an occasional basis clear through 1993, but the first 3 seminars, 1967 and 68, were the most far-reaching in terms of their theological, historical, and missional impact on the church's development from that time forward. So in summary, I would submit that nearly every theological, historical, missional, educational, and administrative development in the RLDS Community of Christ from 1966 to this time rests on the foundation of the 1966 Statement of Objectives, as further articulated and expanded during the 1970s.
Oh, wow. I mean, I have always known that I, as a minister in Community of Christ, stand on the shoulders of giants, but I'm not even sure how much I know about the Statement of Objectives. Like, I'm not sure I knew very much about it at all, but I can hear so many threads about what I've learned in seminary, what I talk about as a minister right now through what you're saying, the building Zion around the world, and how important our theology is, and how important it is to develop our theology. And I was just saying last night to a seeker, just saying how much the seminary has changed Community of Christ and how we've really expanded who we are. But I can see now, talking to you, Richard, that, I mean, these seeds started 40 years before the seminary even got started. So, I mean, it's just amazing to me.
Yep, it is. And it raises the question of causation in church history. When does an event finally run its course and have no longer any impact? It's very hard for me. On some events, it's very easy to see where that happens. But on this one, we're much of our identity and our sense of who we are in the world. We don't any longer talk about Zion as the remnant community withdrawn from the world and waiting Christ's return. We don't talk that way anymore. We don't think that way. We don't even feel that way anymore. We're thinking more of Zion as being the interface between a caring church and the larger world.
Thank goodness you and so many others went through those difficult moments. And there's still difficult moments for the church to face. There's no doubt about it. But having you and those brave pioneers go through those things and talk about those things and start to expand members' ideas of Zion and the theology has really borne fruit for me as a minister in Community of Christ. And I'm so grateful for that.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Thank you.
So actually, it's almost brought me to tears, Richard. So I'm so grateful. Okay, let's go on. Before I start crying and embarrass myself, let's go on to number 3. What's for you, the third most pivotal moment in Community of Christ history?
I think it was the quest for a short name honoring our heritage and our mission. And this was a whole series of moments leading up to the critical one in 2000. I'll start with a little story. I was serving the United States Army in military intelligence, and I was a special agent for the Counterintelligence Corps. And it was during the McCarthy frenzy over communist under every bush or behind every bush and under every rock.
Wait a second. I have to interrupt. So a counterintelligence, I'm not good with military stuff. Does that mean you were against intelligence or the opposite of intelligence?
Sometimes it means both, really. Okay. Anyway, one day I was driving in my work. I was driving toward the Sierra Mountains across California, and I passed through this tiny little village to interview somebody that was important to contact. And I happened by a little white church, and I looked at the church closely, and there was a church sign, not the church seal, not the round one that we think of, but just a kind of a rectangular one, and it was fastened to the building, and it said, "The Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints," and then in parentheses underneath, non-Mormon. Well, for me, that seemed to frame our church's dilemma for me all in one. And I hadn't even thought about being the church historian in 1955. I was just trying to survive. But the dilemma was that we had always claimed to be the one true expression of original Mormonism. There were an awful lot of schismatic groups that sprang away from Nauvoo. We were the one true. In fact, our first publication, our first periodical, was called The True Latter-day Saints Herald. And that title went on for at least a decade or more. And so the problem that we had was that our name was quite the same as the Mormon church. Just very, very, just one word different, reorganized. And so in the public mind, we were constantly being misidentified as Mormon. And we had really developed a strong antipathy towards anything Mormon down through the years. And so we were in a real jam. So the next year I went to the World General Conference in Independence. And during that conference, a delegate proposed that we give the church a new short name, Church of Jesus Christ. Well, it was considered briefly, but defeated in 1960, another resolution. And at that conference then, after the conference, I should say, the presidency appointed a church name committee. which then functioned on through the 60s and the early 70s. And at the 72 World Conference declared, the committee submitted its report to the 1972 conference suggesting a new short name, the Saints Church. Well, that name was the one that was actually adopted, the short name adopted by the conference. I think the officers of the church were a little bit apprehensive about it. So were a lot of other people, but the name stuck, particularly in Australia, where they used it right on through to the mid 90s, I think it was. I think the concern, the reservation about it was that it lacked a capacity to relate to the history of the church and the mission of the church. And that's what the church really was beginning to think that was the most important goal to achieve. The 1992 World Conference struggled over the church name issue, and the matter was once again referred to the presidency, and they did the presidential thing. They appointed a committee to make a recommendation for them to forward to the World Conference or otherwise. We met several times. I was on it, and Roger Yerington chaired the committee, and we sent our report to the presidency recommending Church of Jesus Christ. Now, that brought back memories of the 1956 resolution that the short name of the church should be the Church of Jesus Christ. So I was just wondering, is this a case of history repeating itself or what? Anyway, the presidency thanked the committee and that was that, or so we thought.
It's a case of history repeat.
In September 1994, the Joint Council met in Estes Park, Colorado for a retreat, a weekend retreat. I think it was a weekend, might have been several more days. In Estes Park, Colorado, USA. And toward the conclusion of their earnest discussions, a surprisingly strong consensus began to form about this new short name for the church, Community of Christ. They reported their consensus and the sense of spiritual abiding, if you will, or presence during the closing part of their consideration. And so they bore their witness in the Herald about how this name came into being. Well, but they didn't anticipate that they would adopt it anytime soon. They said in 1994, 95, through the Herald, encourage people, and they had some articles about it, encourage people to discuss this in their congregation, write their views in the Herald, which the church membership was quick to do. So there was a lot of discussion in print in the Herald from the various jurisdictions about the new name. Some of the reservations about it were that community seemed so generic. It was, I don't know, big deal, community. Well, church president Grant McMurray came to their aid, and he said this in response to such doubts. He gave a direct and durable connection between Zion and community. He pointed out that actually what the church was trying to do in the 1830s was to establish community of trust and interdependence. And so I think Grant McMurray tended to allay some of the fears of some of the people about this sort of nondescript name using the word community, which didn't mean much until later. You know, I think many RLDS members and leaders developed for the first time an affection for this new name that would give them opportunities to rejoice in a name that conveyed Christian moorings and centered in the process of building up communities of joy, hope, and love and peace as they did, and as we are still striving to do since the turn of the century. So you can mark the conference of 2000 as the moment in which that new name was adopted, and then April of 2001 when it became legal with the signage on the churches and all of that. I thought I'd make just one risky. This is kind of risky. I probably shouldn't say it because it's not historical, but it is not hysterical either. But it's an unnecessary personal note. And you can edit this out if you want to. Sometime during the past decade, I thought of a small but large adjustment in the church's name, the short name, that might be worth considering in the next several generations. And it's this: a short name, community in Christ. Such a change would be small, trading one two-letter preposition for another. Such a change would also be large, involves the affirmation of a theology which is deeper, a more lively identity and relationship between Christ and the church. Well, there's my idiosyncratic leaning. I would never push it, only speak my mind and heart about it on rare occasions. And this is the most recent one here. And that's because I like to think out loud about things both large and small.
Well, I'm glad that you like to think about things both large and small. I think that's super interesting. The whole story, the fact that the name change started in 1956, the idea to change the name in 1956. We might be slow, but we get there eventually, is what I'm thinking about the church right now. No, but I really think it's good that we continue to build that community and build not only support for a new name, but if we kind of live into a new place, then it might be easier to make those larger steps of actually changing the name. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really cool that we've been talking about this since 1956 in World Conference. Mm-hmm. As to your suggestion of community in Christ, I think that makes a lot of sense too. I mean, and Richard, why not say these things? I mean, it's not like you can get fired or anything like that for saying these things. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah. Well, maybe it is. I don't know. I know one thing from this whole deal that we talked about this morning. It occurs to me that the price of progress in any kind of social organization or setting is trouble. As somebody's called it, but it's good trouble, because we learn to shed our fears. We learn to trust one another, and that's really good. We're going to be able to develop and have many more pivotal events that move us from where we are now to places that we can't even imagine. And
I completely agree.
That very excites me a lot.
It is exciting. I think the buzzword that we're using now is the disruption. We want to all have these comfortable lives, and these lives where we, like everything's wonderful and so on and so forth. But those disruptive moments come, and you end up growing and expanding and finding out more of who you are and who your community is. And after that disruption happens, you look back to who you were and you're like, I'm so glad I'm not that person anymore. And it's just all those growing pains that we have to go through. And I'm grateful to you and so many others for going through some pretty big growing pains in the church's history so that I can be where I am now, so I can continue, hopefully, that disruption process. So, Richard, yeah, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and for just, giving us something to think about. And like I said before, if you who are listening to this have some other ideas about what you think are the most pivotal moments in Community of Christ history, please put them in the comments. Let's talk about them more. This is pretty exciting stuff. So thank you again, Richard.
All righty. Thank you. I'm honored to have been invited. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed that too. I really learned a lot. I'm no historian, of course. Most of you who are watching and who know me know that. I'm definitely not a historian, but I never would have thought of those three as the turning points in Community Christ RLDS history. And so I'm really excited that we have Richard Howard with us to answer some of your questions. I've seen some questions come up on YouTube and some questions come up on Facebook. And so if you have more, feel free to put them in the comments. I don't know how many questions we'll get to, but we definitely want to talk to him. So I'm going to bring Richard Howard onto the screen right now. Hi, Richard.
Hello.
So good to have you here. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you for that wonderful interview.
Oh, well, you're welcome. I would have talked a lot longer, but I was out of things to say.
Well, that's always a good reason to stop talking. So, Richard, we have a couple questions. Wendy Eaton asked, she said that Flanders' book was a crucial moment in our history. What do you think the next big research should be on?
Well, I'm a little out of touch with it now because I've been retired 27 years. So I'm not attending those meetings anymore. I don't travel. So I don't know about the future, but one that really was an important one, I think, was George Smith's 2008 book on Nauvoo polygamy. And that was quite a corrective, and he had access to the temple records at Nauvoo, and he examined all of the various plural marriages that took place in Nauvoo. For so many generations, the RLDS people felt that polygamy began in Utah with Brigham Young, and so this really was kind of like the final word on that subject, even though Flanders covered it excellently in his own book in 1965.
Yeah, I think that too. I don't know what the next big research should be. Sometimes I wonder if it should be on ordination of women or if it should be on LGBTQ issues. I just don't know either. I think that that's kind of up for grabs, but I appreciate your answer, Richard. Thank you for that. Another question we got was from Barb Walden, and she asks, what were some of the turning points that didn't make the cut? You said you had to settle on these three because I made you do that. Sorry about that. So what were some of the other ones, if you can remember back? Because we did this interview a while ago. Can you remember back to what didn't make the cut?
Well, some people have expressed the view that perhaps the ordination of women might have been a very important one. And in fact, one of my dear friends suggested that on Facebook, and I came back at him with, well, I don't think the ordination of women would have happened when it did and under the circumstances that it did, unless the objectives, if the objectives had never been offered and given to the church, I don't see that the ordination of women would have happened when it did, because the necessary elements in that, for example, the 1972 conference resolution put forward by Marge Troe, the new director of women's ministries in the church, called for women to have a much more definitive role to play in the decision-making processes in the church. That was in 1972. So that wouldn't have happened without the objectives. Marge Troll might never have come into focus if it hadn't been for the theological and historical and scriptural ferment that was happening after 1966. So I suppose that the ordination of women could easily have been looked at very closely, but I saw it as a kind of a result from the 1966 events.
So you're looking at it as more like a lot of those things came about because of the 1966 Statement of Objections. That's
Yes.
what you're saying?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And would you say other things came about because of that, like open communion, and different other changes that we've made? All of those came from that 1966 Statement of Objectives?
See, the open communion, open and closed communion, that issue came into focus in 1974, right at the height of the theological and ecumenical thrusts of the church, as they were generating quite a bit of energy and momentum in the life of the church. So yeah, the whole matter of open communion, I remember the very first time it was looked at in 1974 by a council of church leaders, and they needed much more time to move ahead any further with it, and so and I remember 20 years later at the World Conference when Grant McMurray was a member of the first presidency, and he presided over the consideration of that, and it was some unforgettable hours of discussion on the conference floor, and McMurray put us through that discussion like he had been in the presidency for 100 years. He had a certain presence about him and an uncanny ability to read the audience and also to sort of feel the summary of what was really going on underneath the surface. So that was quite a good time.
Yeah, I'm grateful that you said that. That's really interesting because like when Grant McMurray was president of the church, I was a youngin. I mean, not that young, but I was a youngin, and so it's good for me to hear about those undercurrents and things that I might not have picked up on as a late teenager or in my early 20s. So that was one turning point you kind of thought of, or at least somebody had thought of. What are some other turning points that you were thinking of that didn't make the cut?
I think the work of the church's Committee on Higher Education, which went on for a generation, and that pointed us in a very important direction. It was part of. I want to look at something else entirely different too. I'm thinking of the Graceland College expansion into a 4-year school with a religion major, and quite a few of the leaders of the church in the 1960s and 70s. I'm not talking about joint council so much as I'm talking about staff people in areas of theology and education and that sort of thing. Those people graduated out of Graceland and its 4-year curriculum and came on to provide the church with a number of very capable leaders. So I'm thinking of that as another pivotal event, if you will, the decision of Graceland to become a university at the turn of the century was another important thing, although it's not exactly a church event so much as it was a church-related event. Mm-hmm.
What's interesting, a little bit interesting, I graduated Graceland in 1999. We were the last group of graduating seniors that got Graceland College on our diplomas. So that's pretty fun. They said, we can change it to university if you want us to. I'm like, no, I like being from Graceland College. So we actually had another question come in from Dave Irby. Hi, Dave. So good to see you and hear from you.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, Dave. He said, what role do you think the church mission statement had on renaming the church? So he's taking two of your turning points. And I think he asked this way early in the interview, so he didn't even know that was going to be your third one. So do you think the statement of objectives also had something to do with renaming the church? I think I already know the answer.
Well, of course, the church name thing started back in 1956, 10 years before the statement on objectives, but we hadn't made very much progress with it in that decade. So when the statement on objectives came out, when you think about your church in terms of its fundamental purpose and mission in the world, you almost inevitably, in the case of our church, coming out of that whole Mormon nexus and constellation of values, we were pointed toward an opening of thinking and imaging as to where we wanted to go and how we wanted to get there, so that when the church finally in 2000 decided on Community of Christ, that was a very, I think you could easily, in sort of honoring Dave Irby's question, you could easily link that moment right on back to the statement on objectives, which spawned a rather wide stream of historical and theological and missional ferment. I would almost say it was almost inevitable by 1994 that the church was going to have a new name, a short name. For legal purposes, we kept the old name, but our new short name really does it, doesn't it? I mean, it gathers up the history and it gathers up the values of our community centered in Christ.
It really does. It really does. And I love at the very end of the interview when you talked about your thoughts on that tiny little middle word of Community of Christ, and maybe call it Community in Christ.
And a little bit of heresy there, you know.
Well, I would expect nothing less from you, Richard.
All right.
Okay, your very last question, because we don't want to keep everyone too long, but I am very curious about this. This question comes from yours truly, Carla K. Long. And my question to you is, what is one or two absolute highlights of your career as church historian and Community of Christ, or RLDS at the time? What are some of the highlights of your career?
Oh, dear. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that very much lately, but I guess probably the highlight was when I retired, and at the conference of 1994, I was planning on Saturday afternoon taking a break from being a delegate and going with my family on a picnic. My daughter was in town from Boston. My son Jim was here, and so Grant McMurray came over to our delegation right before the end of the morning as we were getting ready to break for lunch, and he said, "Now I want you here this afternoon at 2:00." And I said, "I'm taking a break. We're going to go on a picnic with Joy and Kip and their kids, and we're going to have some fun." And he said, "Be here at 2:00. That's it." Well, I always took him pretty seriously, even during the 10 years that he worked for me as his assistant there. Actually, I was grooming him to be the next historian, and I guess that's a case of that's another highlight. I was grooming him to be the next historian, and he ended up being the president of the church. And so that's a case of overachievement, on my part. Okay. And anyway, so I went to the meeting that afternoon in 1994, and he called Barbara and me up to the podium. And we made our way up there, and then he read a letter. Somebody read a letter. Maybe it was President Smith. I can't remember which president did it, but they all look alike. Anyway, Grant, the letter named me to be the historian emeritus, and I looked that up in my favorite dictionary, and it said "turned out to pasture," and so that was a real highlight. And then as we made our way back to our seats in the back of the chamber, somebody in the Detroit stake delegation began singing a hymn that Barbara and I wrote called "Now in This Moment," and it was just one or two voices there, and then pretty soon several thousand people in the auditorium were singing it in unison. So that was really a highlight. I've kind of wiped out everything I can remember about the early 30 years.
Well, those sound like some good highlights. One of your highlights is being turned out to pasture, which is hilarious. And every time we sing "Now in This Moment," I picture you and Barb in my mind, and it almost moves me to tears. It's one of my favorites.
One more thing I wanted to say. A real highlight was being part of the group that organized the John Whitmer Historical Association. And that was just a marvelous experience to see that come into focus back in 1972, and to have a part in the whole laying the groundwork for that and sharing in some of those early years of its work and being its president was a big plus for me. And the other one that I think of is when I was president of the Mormon History Association back in 1990, and we had a marvelous time that year working with my Mormon brothers and sisters out there, planning the agenda for that conference and making our way through it. And anyway, I have a lot of affection for Mormon scholars who have been my close companions for many years.
I love hearing that, Richard. And I always love hearing you speak and hearing what you have to say. I always learn something new. So I stand by my earlier comments about you being brilliant, and no one can budge me from that rock. No one can.
I did my best.
You did wonderful, and I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. And Richard, if you haven't looked on the Facebook Live thing, you should definitely look, because I think you have quite a few fans out there.
Okay. Well,
well, thanks again.
I'm one of your fans, you know.
Oh, stop it. Or keep going. You know me. Yeah. Our love, all of our love, Facebook love and YouTube love to you and Barb. And thanks again.
You're welcome. You're welcome.